Yeah, great. Thanks so very much for the invitation to come back to beautiful Bern and to see old friends again, whom I needed to see because it's been too long. So my talk is going to be slightly autobiographical, and I'm sorry about that. But as I was putting together the talk, I realized that what I really was interested in doing is to explore how my own views have evolved over the years about this topic and where I am coming to now on the topic of experimental or entity realism. And indeed, what I am going to end up defending in this talk is that we ought to keep these two concepts apart. So typically, entity realism and experimental realism have been thought to be synonymous terms, for it's essentially the same position. And when Hacking runs his experimental argument for realism, we often take it to be an argument for the position that we know as entity realism. But nowadays, I am inclined to think that this is really a bad conflation of two positions that ought to be kept separate. And that they really capture different views in the realism debate. One of them, both of them have some arguments going for them, and some of the arguments actually duplicate and count for both positions. But there are at least some interesting scientific cases where the two views basically pull apart, and they just become so sufficiently distinct that we may want to choose one over the other. And astrophysics is a prime example of where this is actually taking place, where entity realism and experimental realism come apart. And they clearly become distinct positions. And in the context of astrophysics, I'm going to be arguing for a deflationary version of what I call experimental realism. I'm going to be arguing that entity realism, by contrast, in this context of astrophysics, leads us to counterintuitive results. And in fact, I've learned a new phrase today. It comes to break the parity thesis between terrestrial and astrophysical phenomenon. And I do agree that if we can keep the parity thesis, that would be a better solution. So that's one of the reasons I have just learned today why you should prefer experimental to entity realism. So that's in a nutshell what I'm going to be doing today. And what I'm going to do is to tell you some of the different ways in which I came to this conclusion, which has been a painstaking realization over very many long years that these two views had to be kept distinct. Okay, so the initial view I started off defending is a version of Nancy Cartwright's argument for inference to the most likely cause. And the central feature of this argument is the feasible causal warrant in favor of hypotheses regarding theoretical, i.e., unobservable entities. And I take the word entity seriously here. I mean, when we popularize Hacking's position by means of this slogan that you can spray electrons, we're really talking about entities. We're talking about some sort of substance endowed with a bunch of attributes. And I take that as an important part of this view known as entity realism. Now, my most recent considered view, which I express in the book that came out with Chicago in 2024, I know some of you have been looking at it, is really a version of Arthur Fine's natural ontological attitude applied to modeling practice. So I'm not going to be focusing, I don't focus so much anymore on the idea of causal warrant, but on the idea, which I claim to be rather distinct and different, of experimental warrant in low-level models of putative interactive entities or properties, observable or not, that prove in some way to be detected. This is a more generic and more general notion than that of causal warrant. And I think that releases you from a bunch of different problems and objections that the other arguments for the sort of inference in most probable or likely cause can be subject to. So that's essentially an announcement of what's coming. The initial view was defended in this volume in honor of Nancy Cartwright that came out in 2008. And in that volume, I ended up defending something I called there the position known as epistemic experimental realism, the idea that manipulation is a necessary and sufficient condition not on the reality of entities, but on causal warrant for the belief in the reality of those entities. And I will come to these distinctions in a minute and try to explain to you how I came to this position. It's important to note that causal warrant on this picture and in agreement with this definition is defeasible. It's warrant that can be defeated by a stronger warrant of the same sort, but it is strictly stronger than any theoretical warrant. I'm a pluralist and I'm very tolerant about other views and other kinds of warrant, but I think if you lose track of the idea that something like causal warrant or experimental warrant on this sort of views must be strictly stronger than theoretical warrant, then you're losing track of what fundamentally distinguishes an entity or experimental realism from other varieties of realism. And so that one thing is the one that has stayed constant throughout my work, that if you want to defend entity or experimental realism as a distinct view from any other kind of scientific realism, you really need to defend the view that something like causal or experimental warrant is defeasible, but always stronger than theoretical or merely theoretical warrant. This is the one thing that has stayed constant, and I continue to defend to this present day. Okay, so the new view, the considered view, is, as I said, more general than this. So on the most recent view, I defend something that I call the experimental modeling attitude. And this is the idea that scientific models may possess two types of warrant, experimental and theoretical warrant. An experimental warrant is strictly stronger than theoretical warrant in the sense that no theoretical warrant against the existence of some entity postulated in a model may, ceteris paribus, defeat experimental warrant for that entity. So essentially, before we had two kinds of warrant for putative entities. Nowadays, I defend that we have two kinds of warrant for models that postulate certain kinds of entities. That's the key distinction. Experimental warrant on this picture is more general. So ergo, it is easier to achieve or acquire than causal warrant, but it is also, recall, defeasible and strictly stronger than any theoretical warrant. If we lost track of this, we would then have a position that is indistinguishable from any kind of theoretical scientific realism. And I think what's exciting about entity and experimental realism is this promise that you can get the goods of ontological commitment in entities that are postulated by science that are not observable without committing yourself to the present day theories about those entities. That still excites me. I think that's really an interesting insight that Hacking and Cartwright had, and I continue to run with it. But as you can see, in ways that are very different to the original ways in which I used to defend these things. So I want to tell you a little bit of the story of how I got to this view, from the initial view to the more considered view, and then exactly what the implications of this more considered view are for scientific epistemology in general. So the key thought here is that we arguably have good observational evidence for the putative interactive physical capacities of entities, and I refrain from calling them causal properties, okay, for reasons that I alluded at in the response to Gavan, and we can go back to in the discussion. And they're postulated in robustly confirmed models in fields such as astrophysics. We had a wonderful talk about ecology at the beginning of the session today, history and paleontology, about which we haven't spoken, but they could be nice examples of where entity and experimental realism may have bite. I think neuroscience, we talked about that as well. And perhaps in sociology, social population, and also in population medical studies, these notions may have some bite. So these are all fields where I think entity realism and experimental realism may come apart, and where you may have good reasons to suppose experimental realism works and goes through, but maybe not so good reasons to think that entity realism goes through or works in the same way. Then there are a bunch of other areas where the two notions may coincide, and very similar arguments will work for both entity realism and experimental realism. So there's a lot of overlap between these positions in practice. But there are these key fields where I can see that they would necessarily maybe come apart. The two views would necessarily come apart. Okay, so how does the argument go here all the way to this new experimental modeling attitude? So let me tell you a little bit of the story as I see it. When Hacking and Cartwright first introduced this position known as entity realism, very many of us took them to be defending some sort of metaphysical claim about the nature of reality. I have had on good conversations that I've had with both, and things that I've seen them publish and write since then, that at some point they were both wedded to some sort of metaphysical picture of this position. In the case of Ian Hacking, he even responded to me at some point, claiming that he definitely wanted to hold on to the metaphysical version of entity realism. So I have no doubt about that. In the case of Nancy Cartwright, I think she veered towards the epistemic version of entity realism as time went on. But at the beginning, I think both had something like this view in mind. The idea that manipulation is a necessary and sufficient condition on reality, that is, that an entity X is real if and only if it can be manipulated. Now, it sort of becomes clear in the 1989 paper that Hacking cannot possibly be committed to manipulation being both necessary and sufficient on the reality of any putative and observable entity, because there he claims, remember in this wonderful paper on extragalactic reality, he claims that when it comes to the objects of extragalactic astrophysics or galactic astrophysics, the right attitude to have is not skepticism, but constructive empiricism about the nature of galaxies and stars and so on. And on constructive empiricism, it's not so much that these entities are not real, but rather it is that we don't have good evidence for supposing their existence. So we must remain agnostic, and you know all the story that goes with Bas van Frassen's voluntarist epistemology for the sorts of entities that are non-observable and about which we can only have inferential knowledge. So Hacking makes this claim explicit in that paper that the right attitude to have to stars and galaxies is the attitude of a constructive empiricist. So that suggests to me, when I read that paper, I thought Hacking cannot possibly mean that manipulation is a necessary and sufficient condition on the reality of entities. It may be a sufficient condition, but it cannot be necessary, because in the case of these entities that are extragalactic, they may be real. For all we know, we must remain agnostic, but we can certainly not manipulate them. So therefore, it's not a necessary condition. So he must have had in mind something weaker, such as perhaps this metaphysical condition on experimental realism that are written at the bottom of this slide. Manipulation is a sufficient condition on reality. X is real, X can be manipulated, but not necessary. At any rate, there's no significant difference between what I call here the metaphysical experimental realism and the metaphysical condition on experimental realism. They both prey to the same set of objections. Okay, so what are those objections? There are three sets of families of arguments in the literature against these metaphysical variants of the position known as entity realism. First of all, there are arguments that charge these positions with inadequacy and claim that these views are inadequate or provide inadequate pictures of scientific practice, where beliefs about manipulation and theoretical beliefs are typically intertwined. So this metaphysical rendition of entity realism cannot provide an adequate picture of scientific practice. Then there's a family of arguments that charge these views with incoherence and claim that these views are incoherent because whether entities are in fact manipulated depends on the theoretical account that we have of those entities. And finally, there's a third family of arguments that charge these views with what I would suggest is a claim of implausibility. That is, even though they may be coherent, these views provide an implausible account of scientific practice. Not inadequate, maybe, not incoherent, maybe, but certainly philosophically implausible, and we can show that to be the case. Now, in response to these families of arguments, which were sort of being voiced all throughout the 1980s and particularly the 1990s, I came to accepting some of these arguments against this metaphysical rendition of entity realism. I came to defend an epistemic version of entity realism or experimental realism. And this is a first deflationary move because it moves one down from the level of metaphysics to the level of epistemology, where you studied sort of the epistemic commitments of scientists, as opposed to necessarily studying their metaphysics or even their ontological commitments. And on this view, manipulation is a necessary and sufficient condition on, as I was saying at the beginning, causal warrant, our belief in the reality of some entity acquires this special warrant, if and only if this entity can be manipulated, but it is not a necessary or sufficient condition on the reality of the entity. Why is this significant and important? The reason is because this deflationary move allows you to construct a position that can answer at least some of the objections that are voiced or raised in these three different families, inadequacy, incoherence, and implausibility. So let me run very quickly through these sets of objections. Inadequacy is the objection that the position yields an inadequate picture of scientific practice, where beliefs about manipulation and theoretical beliefs are typically intertwined. And this was very eloquently expressed by Resnick, who wrote that the experimental realist, that is, the scientist who does and practices science, can only have knowledge about theoretical entities if she assumes that the theories that describe those entities are at least approximately true. So either of the metaphysical versions or variants of entity realism boils down then to the traditional view known as scientific realism about theories, because in order to have a picture that does justice to the way in which scientists go about having knowledge of theoretical entities, you will have to assume that they presuppose that the theories about those entities are true. And that, of course, is the position that we know as traditional scientific realism. In fact, this argument does not refute the metaphysical variants of entity realism. This is something that I pointed out in that 2008 paper or chapter in the volume in honor of Nancy Cartwright. It only really refutes something that I call their belief possession, or call it, if you want, psychological experimental realism. That is the view that manipulation is a necessary and sufficient condition on the acquisition of existential beliefs about these entities. That is, this Resnick inadequacy type of objection can only really refute views that claim that scientists only acquire beliefs about entities through their manipulating those entities. And that's a view that's defended by nobody, as far as I know, in the debate around entity or experimental realism. I mean, nobody that I know believes that scientists can only acquire their belief in a certain entity when they manipulate them. Typically, we acquire beliefs in all kinds of entities by, amongst other things, testimony from other scientists who pass on theoretical knowledge to us. That's how we typically acquire those initial theoretical beliefs. So nobody, I don't think Hacking or Cartwright ever defended this sort of version of experimental realism. So the inadequacy family of objections seems to me to misfire against either experimental or entity realism. The incoherent set of objections, though, is more formidable. And I did in the 2008 paper concede that this refutes the metaphysical variants of entity or experimental realism, and I still am inclined to think that this is true. This is the famous Flectron objection that some of you may have heard. Maybe you're too young to have heard of this objection. This was an objection often voiced by Peter Lipton. We talked a lot about this objection and ran this objection past me often. Margaret Morrison also talks about it. This is the objection that says, look, when you're talking about electrons, you're talking about theoretical entity, which is fully informed by the theory of atomic physics. That's the theory that provides all the full list of properties that we ascribe to an entity like an electron. But when you manipulate an electron in an electron microscope, you're only using a subset of the theoretical properties that are ascribed to the entity by the theory. And so therefore, if Haken's argument is right, if either of the two metaphysical variants of the argument are right, then you would only be entitled to commit yourself to the properties of the electron that you're actually manipulating in the electron microscope. But the entity that is made up of those properties is not an electron, is an entity that is just made up by that subset of the properties of the electron, maybe not spin, but just mass and charge. Call it a flectron. So the electron microscope only really entitles you to believe in flectrons and not in electrons. And if you run a different kind of experiment with electrons in which you employ a different subset of the properties of the electron, then you would be entitled to believe in plectrons, but not in electrons, right? So every different kind of manipulation that you make, that you carry out on electrons, depending on the sort of properties that are manipulated, will entitle you to believe in a different sort of entity. And in no case would you be entitled to believe in the entity that we call the electron. So as an argument for the reality of electrons, this is rather poor. And in fact, it's very confusing because you end up with all this commitment to all these sorts of entities, none of which is an electron. So I thought, and I still think there's quite a lot going for this objection, but it only really cuts against the metaphysical variants of experimental or entity realism. It only cuts against either the idea that manipulation is necessary and sufficient for the reality of an entity, or that manipulation is sufficient but not necessary for the reality of the entity. Because only under this variance of entity realism do you get the conclusion that you're only committed to an entity that is not the electron, but something short of the electron. So I take it that the incoherence arguments, and there are a number of different arguments around, are effective in refuting the metaphysical versions of experimental realism. And ever since 2008, I've tried to develop a version of entity or experimental realism that is not metaphysical in character. And the one nice thing that you can show is that this flectron objection does not refute any epistemic version of entity realism, such as, for instance, the epistemic version of entity or experimental realism that I just proposed, namely that manipulation is a necessary and sufficient condition on causal warrant. Our belief in the reality of an entity acquires this warrant if and only if the entity can be manipulated. Why is this? Because you can have causal warrant only through a subset of the properties of an entity, but the warrant is nonetheless for the belief in the full set of properties of the entity as described theoretically. I mean, you can have warrant for the existence of tables because you interact with the surface of the table, but that warrant accrues to the whole entity and not just to the surface of the table. So from this point of view, you can have this sort of experimental realism, which is purely epistemic in the face of the incoherence charge, as long as you keep it free from any metaphysical commitment. Then there's the implausibility set of arguments, which I think that go even farther than the incoherence arguments. This is the idea that even though experimental realism may be coherent, it provides an implausible account of scientific practice. And the most eloquent version of this argument, which I think is still worth reading, and I still think it's rather powerful, is due to Chris Hitchcock, who addressed specifically the epistemological version of inference to the most likely cause, the version of experimental realism that was defended by Nancy Cartwright in The Laws of Physics Lie and other papers. And he asked, what is special about the role of explanation? Remember, inference to the most likely cause is inference to the causal explanation that lists the causal property, the most likely cause of a particular phenomenon you're trying to explain. So it is an inference to an explanation, but of a particular sort, causal sort, which Cartwright argues that it's more accessible or readily accessible than a theoretical explanation. And Hitchcock asked the very good question, what is so special about the role of explanation, such that only causal stories filling that role and not some other must be believed if they are accepted. Now, I thought in 2008 that this objection could be addressed, that one could respond to this objection by appealing to certain features of inference to the most likely cause, which distinguish that kind of inference from inference to the best theoretical explanation in general. And I did put together this defense of this view in a chapter. The two main features that were critical were the non-redundancy of causal explanation. So causal explanation was supposed to be non-redundant in a way that theoretical explanation is not. That basically means that for any theoretical explanation of a phenomenon, you have an indeterminate number of alternative theoretical explanations of the same phenomenon, but it doesn't seem to be the case for inference to the most likely cause, that you can have alternative explanations of that phenomenon, because only one cause is the real cause and only that one has explanatory power. But of course, that sort of begs the question. And then the other aspect of inference to the most likely cause that was very relevant was this idea of the materiality of the inference. That is, that inferences to the most likely causal explanation are material. They're formulated in the material mode and not in the formal mode, so they don't appeal to theoretical properties. They appeal directly to the causal properties of entities. We don't claim the atomic theory explains atomic phenomena. We claim electrons with their properties, as endowed with those properties, explain atomic phenomena. And that seemed to me very relevant at the time. I still think that's kind of the most interesting argument for inference to the most likely cause, the fact that they're normally written in the material mode. But I nowadays don't think non-redundancy really goes as far as I thought. I've been convinced by Hitchcock that you can always find alternative explanations, even causal explanations of a phenomenon written in the language of causal inference for any phenomenon that are just as likely or as plausible as any other. And you can never rule them out completely. So let me tell you exactly why. I nowadays, I want to argue that even the epistemic version of entity realism is probably indefensible. I believe the response that I put together on behalf of Cartwright is inadequate because no version of the inference to the most likely cause is going to survive eventually some aspects of Hitchcock's critique. Causal explanations may reduce the exuberant redundancy of theoretical explanations. But even if when you have experimental controls that are exceedingly high in very strict laboratory conditions, those explanations are not entirely non-redundant. There's always going to be some alternative that can be postulated in terms of some hidden variable causal model that is eventually available. With ingenuity, you can always find a causal graph that is an alternative to the most likely cause that you thought that you had most definitely determined, and you're never going to be able to exclude it completely. Yes, it reduces the redundancy, but no, it doesn't kill the redundancy. And then the other problem is that as regards material inference, there are all kinds of experimental inferences, not necessarily causal inferences. And I guess this claim that I've just made is very sensitive and depends very much on what account of causation you have. But I think for almost any account of causation, it is true that there are kinds of experimental inference that can also be rendered in the material mode and that are not necessarily causal in the prescribed way. And so it's not just causal inferences that can be rendered in the material mode of a speech, what Carnap used to call the material mode of speech. So I think even the epistemic version of experimental or entity realism is probably not going to survive Hitchcock's critique. So my second deflationary move, the most recent move, is to extend the position, the original position, so that it's scientific models as a whole rather than causal explanations that are the object that acquire this special sort of warrant. And this is why I'm moving from entity realism to experimental realism. The kind of warrant that is involved is no longer causal warrant for the entities that figure in most likely causal explanations of phenomena, but is now more generally experimental warrant for the models that list certain putative entities and their interactive character, which may appear as descriptions of that phenomena. So this is what I call the experimental modeling attitude. Scientific models may possess two types of warrant, experimental and theoretical, and experimental warrant is stronger than theoretical warrant, in the sense that no theoretical warrant against the existence of some entity postulated in a model may ceteris paribus defeat experimental warrant for that entity, and that's enough. If you believe this, you already have enough here for the makings of a position that is realist, but it's not theoretically realist. So call it experimental realism. Experimental warrant is more general than causal warrant, and it remains defeasible as we would like it to be, and stronger than any theoretical warrant. The experimental warrant for the reality of some entity can only be appended on this view by experimental warrant against that entity, or maybe experimental warrant in favor of some incompatible entity with this one. Now, this thesis that I now defend, the primacy of experimental warrant, is in general, rather than specifically causal warrant, ensues in something that I would like to call experimental realism rather than just entity realism. And the two views come apart at this point, because it's possible to have experimental warrant in a model that describes the material or interactive capacities of entities, including processes, phenomena, effects, or regularities. I call this experimental realism. We go back to the idea, to the discussion about whether it's entities or phenomena, processes, and so on. We can talk about this in discussion. I think it's an interesting distinction. You can have this sort of experimental warrant while lacking causal warrant, that those entities can be manipulated to further inquiry into other entities or further parts of reality. And this is the position that we know as entity realism. We know that electrons are real because we can spray them. If you want to stick to that slogan, you really have to believe that entity realism boils down to something like this. It's very hard to see how you can have the latter without the former. So no entity realism without experimental realism, I think that's true. But you can have experimental realism without entity realism. And that's the advantage that accrues in areas or fields such as astrophysics. Okay, just to make clear what the advantages of this move are, if you make this a second deflationary move, you end up with a position, experimental realism, that would enjoy all the advantages of traditional entity realism, but will provide illuminating discussions of recalcitrant cases in the history of science. For instance, phlogiston, the ether, the epicycles. There's no way to make sense of why scientists believe in these entities on anything like the entity realism that I've defended here, either the metaphysical or the epistemic variety. But on the experimental, the more general version of experimental realism, it's very easy to see why scientists came to believe in these entities. They thought they had experimental warrant in them. Priestley carried out all kinds of interventions in laboratory conditions for the reality of phlogiston, and he convinced himself that he had extremely strong warrant for the existence of phlogiston. It was only experimental warrant of the same sort against phlogiston and for oxygen that could lead anybody to reject the postulation of phlogiston in the first place. No theory was going to convince Priestley. Only further interventions in the laboratory of the sort that Lavoisier carried out with oxygen could convince a defender of the phlogiston theory. And that's exactly what happened. Same thing with the ether. You can tell the same story. People thought they could manipulate the ether and, in fact, extract energy out of it. Wonderful stories that circulated around the 19th century. They were convinced that they had that kind of experimental warrant. And it's only when Einstein comes along and gives them experimental warrant for the four-dimensional structure of space-time, which denies the existence of the ether, that they convince themselves that they finally give up on the existence of the ether. Explains why people hang on to the ether for so long. They thought they had experimental warrant on this ether. But the greatest advantage, as I say here, pertains probably to areas of science where experimental warrant for the interactive capacities of any entities is unproblematically and regularly achieved, yet causal warrant for those entities is scarce, contentious, or hard to come by. And here I want to say causal warrant, I mean in the sense that you can manipulate the entity in order to probe into further aspects of reality. So the original insight that Hawking had with respect to electrons. And astrophysics is a prime example. We cannot use the causal properties of astrophysical entities in order to probe into further entities, but we can have a lot of experimental warrant for those entities. Now, the rest of my talk, which I only have, what, 5 minutes to give? How long do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
You can go on.
No, in 5 minutes, I will explain to you how it is that I've come to convince myself entity realism will not work in the context of astrophysics, but experimental realism does. And I want to do that by applying these lessons to the idea of a star in stellar structure models in stellar astrophysics. And I've written about this for a while. I have a series of papers going on this topic for a long time. And I've also been changing my views on the nature of stars as we've been acquiring lots of new evidence coming from asteroseismology regarding the nature of stars and stellar objects. And this chimes in, I now would like to claim, with this deflationary move from entity realism towards experimental realism. So I've written these 2 papers and I changed my mind in those intervening 10 years about how we should think about stellar objects in astrophysics. Initially, I thought a star was just essentially a fictional entity in a philosophically prescribed, well-prescribed sense, in the sense that we have all kinds of fictive assumptions in stellar structure models about which we cannot say that they probably or even approximately approach any true description of what these objects are like. These assumptions are concern the luminosity and effective surface temperature in stellar objects, which are often called the observational quantities of astrophysics, but in fact, they're not observable in any philosophically interesting sense. They're definitely inferred. They're low-level inferences. They're the result of low-level inferences from the actually observable quantities, which are the incident radiation flux into the telescope and the spectral decomposition of the star. Those things you can actually observe. Now, on the basis of this, you plot this Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, which produces this very clear luminosity temperature correlation. And this tells you roughly the evolution, the life evolution of every stellar object. Stars are born here and then they move down the so-called main sequence of stars. And you want models that can account for how stars move down, have these kinds of life evolutions down the main sequence. And you use models that have these 4 fundamental assumptions. A uniform initial composition of hydrogen and helium, the idea that the stars are isolated objects, the idea that they're spherically symmetrical objects, the idea that they're objects in thermal equilibrium. All of them are possibly, probably, not just false, but very far from the truth for any object that we call a star. But when you put them all together, you get this remarkably easy models to handle with 4 fundamental equations, which you can solve easily for any stellar object. You can plug in the observable quantities of that object, and you get a really nice and neat structure for that stellar object that would explain those observable quantities. So it's a formidable set of assumptions for very, very efficient mathematical models of these objects. But we know they're not true. The uniform initial composition is at best a controllable idealization. We have plenty of modular data for it. Certain stars have heavier elements as stars age, they gain heavier elements. The isolation assumption is a potential idealization, but not control force so far. I mean, a star isn't really properly isolated from the interstellar medium, but it's in constant physical exchange with the interstellar medium. A spherical symmetry, this is an uncontrollable fiction. We know there's no it to be false for every interesting star. No star is spherically symmetric. And thermal equilibrium is an uncontrollable fiction in the original models. We know it to be really very far away from the truth. So models of the stars, I took it to be fictive in this very strong sense, and that has some consequences for entity and experimental realism. If the assumptions that go into stellar structure models are fictive, then we can have no warrant, causal or experimental, for the existence of the entities and properties that make up a star. Star is a fiction, also in the sense that it is not a real entity on these accounts. Insofar as the only criterion we have to suppose an entity is real is given by either of these two criteria that I just provided you with. And even experimental realism in the sense that I've come on to describe would really give you here the result that a star is anything other than a fiction. Fortunately, however, we get an awful lot of evidence coming in the last 15 years or so from stereosismology that has turned our views on some of the assumptions that underlie these models. We now know that the spherical symmetry assumption is a controllable idealization. We know how to control for it. And we know, in fact, for many stars exactly what their oblong shape is. And we know thermal equilibrium is a controllable idealization. We know how far it is from the truth for lots of stellar objects. And we know exactly what layers are now inside the stars and how convective and radioactive forces interrelate within the layers of the stars. In fact, we know the interior of the stars better than we nowadays know the interior of the Earth, which is in many ways remarkable. And this is all new. This new evidence coming in the last 15 years or so from the kind of stereosismological studies, longitudinal studies we have been doing of the vibrations on the stellar surfaces, which tell us incredible amounts of information regarding the inside of the stars. So now we have a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram that looks much more like this, where every stellar object vibrates around within the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, and the vibrations tell you everything you need to know about the inner layers of stars. So now I think stereosismological research and data reveals exactly the shape of stars and the oblong shape of most stars that we have this amount of longitudinal data for, and a very detailed picture of convective and radiative layers in the stars. So we know exactly where the thermal equilibrium assumption is true and where it is not within the body of the star. Star is not a fiction, it's an idealized description of a real object. And this chimes in with this experimental modeling attitude that I nowadays defend. Scientific models may possess two types of warrants. I said experimental and theoretical, and experimental warrant is stronger than any theoretical warrant. To the contrary, and can only be defeated by experimental warrant of a contrary type. So the only sorts of discoveries that would allow us to, or that would entice us to make changes in our conception of a star and how these assumptions fail is further experimental evidence that we can elicit from the stars by looking at their vibrations and therefore the inner layers of the stars and how they actually behave. That sort of experimental evidence will be required. Another theoretical model will not change our conception of these objects. So I nowadays claim this knowledge that we have about the stars satisfies the experimental modeling attitude and this experimental realism, general notion of experimental realism, even though it may fail to satisfy both the metaphysical and the epistemic variant of what I call entity realism. And that's really it. And that's all I wanted to say for today. Experimental realism and entity realism come apart in observational sciences where causal entities cannot be readily manipulated. We cannot manipulate the interior of a star, but where we have as much evidence as we can possibly have in models describing the interactive capacities of those entities. And there, I would advise you to be an experimental realist, because then you can claim a star is a real object and not an entity realist, because in that case, you would be condemned forever to remaining agnostic about the existence of stars, galaxies, and the universe as a whole, not a position that I advise anybody to.